All right, this is the third lecture for Chapter 3, probably the last. And just to keep on going with this idea of GPP and NPP, gross primary productivity, net primary productivity. And we can kind of see how well we use energy. You can also think about this a little bit, how solar panels work, which we'll do an activity on much later in the year. But just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So we have all the sunlight, and you look at how plants take it in. And you can see that most of the energy, solar energy, is reflected or passes through producers without actually being used. So only about 1% of it hits producers and produces photosynthesis. Not very efficient, 1%. But plants got all the time in the world, so they seem to do okay. So it's interesting looking at how efficient they have become over time. Most of it isn't used at all. Then you can see that a lot of it is just used in regards to gross primary productivity, and you don't use it. It's gone. Only about, 40% of 1% actually goes into making that plant that you see. All right, we're not going to go terribly far with soils, not right now. But if you look on the left-hand side of that slide, picture I have there, those little horizons. I want you to know a little bit about some of those. You'll see that on the test. The O horizons is organic, the stuff that's sort of still living, maybe recently dead, on the surface. It's not the soil, it's the stuff on top of the soil. So recently dead stuff, or even some living stuff still out there. The A horizon, that's the topsoil, the dark stuff that when you put your shovel in the ground, that's the first stuff you hit. The B horizon is a little bit below that. So if you start digging a hole, eventually you're going to go through that really dark soil, and then you're going to hit something else. That's the B horizon, the subsoil. And then if you were really to keep on digging, probably need a backhoe for that, you're going to start getting into something other again still. The C horizon, which has to do with some of the parent material. Not as well broken down. And this is just a little lens kind of showing you some of these different layers within there. And we're still primarily looking at just into probably the B, the A, the O, A, and B horizons within here. There are different lenses within these soils that you go through. And I'm not going to bother with some of these. This is just some examples of different type of soils in different biomes. Something else I will ask you to know is the types of soils in regards to just those three, sand, silt, and clay. We'll mention those right now. Sand is the largest, as you can see in the little picture, is the largest particle size, and clay is the smallest. In regards to, this is not written on your slide, porosity, how porous they are. Clay actually has the most pores, but it is the least permeable because those pores are so many, but yet they are so small. Water adheres, it sticks to the soil particles and does not pass through easily. Where sand has a very high permeability because of the size of the particles, it can go through them more easily. It doesn't adhere to the particles as easily. Silt's somewhere in the middle. We'll do an activity with some dirt, soil, in class. Why is water so important? Water is just fascinating. We could spend an entire year just talking about how cool, no pun intended, water is. It's got all these little features that you're seeing here pop up on the slide. It just does a lot of amazing things to make life possible here on Earth. So these are things that we do that kind of mess things up. We're pretty good at that. We overuse water. This is especially true in the middle of the country. The Agalaga, I always kind of struggle saying that. Aquifer in the middle of the country. We'll talk about that later in the year. Always mentioning things that are later in the year. Clearing vegetation. Vegetation is really good as far as storing and gathering and holding water. Polluting it, making it not as usable. And then just a very gentle term in regards to climate change, just changing conditions that have allowed the water cycle to do what it always has. So the carbon cycle, I will try not to go through every single one of these because you are a little bit familiar with some of these, and of course you can pause the slide and read it yourself as you're going through. Looking at the carbon cycle, you can see all these different ways it's gone through, how it cycles. We'll do a little activity again on this in class. And on the left-hand side is showing like how we have used carbon and the CO2 emissions over time. Nitrogen cycle is a big deal. College Board loves the nitrogen cycle. So this is one of those slides you will want to pause and kind of go through all of these different stages, all these definitions. You'll do mix and match on this. You'll have to understand how each one works. Ask me about it in class and we can talk about it then as well. But all these little parts in regards to whether it's assimilation or modification, denitrification, nitrification, these are all important. And again, College Board really likes nitrogen cycle. And again, we can go over this slide in class if you'd like to. The nitrogen cycle is also interesting because it has changed human population. In the early 1900s, 1920 or so, we figured out how to synthetically make ammonium fertilizer. And in doing so, we were able to beat nature and make more food than was available or possible before, so we could feed a very much larger population. And that has allowed us to have our explosion that we have had. Phosphorus cycle, you can see here. What's interesting about the phosphorus cycle is the other ones have a liquid state, aqueous, a gaseous state, and a solid state. The phosphorus cycle is the only one of these cycles that does not have a gaseous state. So it's got a solid and an aqueous, but it does not have a gaseous state. So you can kind of go through this slide on your own and look at how it's kind of moving around and see some of the sinks, the locations that it is stored for periods of time, and then how it is released into different locations. Sulfur cycle, and again, you're probably most familiar with that one in regards to acid rain, but what are some of the natural components that produce sulfur into the environment, and what are some of the anthropogenic, the human generations of sulfur? I'll let you kind of go through that slide on your own and see how sulfur cycles through. Okay, ways that we look at the ecosystem. Notice we have these layers on the right-hand side of the slide. There's different ways we kind of go through and map ecosystems. We can do it just directly going through and doing surveys. And there's remote sensing, in which you will go through with like satellites or planes and take pictures of different layers. And we can use computer programs. And we can put all these things together in GIS, Geographic Imaging Systems, if I'm not mistaken. And put all those things together. We can put all this in there and have a nice picture. There's a couple of programs. There's a whole career you can get into with GIS, which is really fascinating stuff. I took a class years ago on it. Pretty interesting stuff. But it's a way of, again, of breaking apart different layers of an ecosystem to see kind of what's going on and what's affecting what. Systems analysis is another way of kind of analyzing, it's right in the name, an ecosystem and what is affecting what. So again, we have a system, which we talked about in a chapter before, looking at the inputs, how it's affecting it, and what are the outputs for that system. And you can kind of go through and dissect this a little bit more on your own. That is the last slide for Chapter 3.